Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of a new series, Kinder Every Day. I want to credit Katie for the title and Dustin at Smarter Every Day for inspiring it, a person who does really cool videos about science and engineering and learning about lots of new things. This is my attempt to learn about new societal things, social things, personal things, and the needs and struggles of other people. I have spent the last probably 5-6 years kind of dedicatedly learning about that stuff, and building up some amount of understanding from, a relatively uninformed, privileged viewpoint, about the needs of other people, about the needs of women, of non-binary people, transgender people, people of colour, disabled people, basically people from all walks of life that are currently uncared for or undercared for, I guess, and underrepresented in normal media and in the power structures, basically like the upper echelons of society. So, this is, I thought about titling this video, white man talks about women or something, right? This is stuff that I have learned, or ideally maybe well learn about for individual videos, over the last some years of talking to people, listening to people, and trying to understand essentially the harsh realities of life that I've been insulated from, or that I've missed. Each video, I don't know how often these are going to come out. I'll be honest, making this one is quite scary, and is very much a test, and we'll see how it goes. The idea is each one is going to be relatively short. It might be short by my standards, but hopefully actually short. And cover just some bite-sized piece of understanding that either I have been taught or that I've picked up myself, or that we've maybe just researched for the video. And the goal is to help spread knowledge and understanding for people who are like me, right? For people who care or think they care, or even people who don't care. If you're coming to this video thinking, man, all this SJW stuff is really overblown, this is for you. This particular episode is especially for you, because I think, although it is somewhat hypocritical of me to make these videos in my own voice, rather than directly quote or uplift the voices of marginalized people. Rather than, morally, I guess I should not talk for women or talk for black people or anything like that, but instead to just show their views to you directly. But I also know that hearing stuff from people who are like you can help. And I know that this sort of content would have helped me at some point. And I guess I still would, right? That's, to be truthful. So, hopefully hearing this stuff from a voice that you feel comfortable listening to can help. So this episode is called I Could Have Been an Incel. I consider myself a person who at least tries to understand the needs of other people and tries to learn about my own, the gaps in my own knowledge and my biases, and support a fairer and kinder society for everybody. But I could have gone down the other way if just a few things had gone a little differently in my life. Not all that long ago either. So for those unfamiliar with the term, incel it's short for involuntary celibate, It is a term originally used, self-described, by a group of people online, men generally, who believe that they are essentially locked out of receiving sex or romantic attention from women, and then turn that round into essentially hating women or resenting them and their place in this in society. With that comes a push against diversity measures, against fairness, against equality for women, against representation in media. There is an overlap between the incel community, I don't know if it is a community per se, but incels generally, and this sort of mindset, and related mindsets of, anti-diversity, and gaming. We'll get into that shortly. And I think now broadly the term, I'm using the term here to just generally mean angry, sexist internet men. Although even then, you can be a female and hold these viewpoints. You can be a non-binary person and hold these viewpoints. A lot of people who follow this kind of pattern also end up expressing viewpoints that are racist or homophobic or ableist. Like I said, there is sort of a general anti-diversity push from this quarter of society. And that, I at points in my life, I have come close enough to falling off that particular tightrope myself. So I grew up relatively sheltered. I didn't have a ton of life experience before going to university. In my house, my mum was generally in charge. And I was never really told about or exposed to modern sexism. I grew up thinking that it was a past thing, a historical thing. And similarly with racism, I grew up thinking it was a thing of the past. When you're in that mindset, you don't notice stuff that's right in front of you. I remember thinking that the way movies segregated people by gender, where you had the one love interest in the action movie, and then you had these rom-coms that I thought were equivalent towards men. I wouldn't say that nowadays, but that was kind of my reading on it. I noticed that, but I never really twigged that was part of any wider puzzle, right? I just thought it was marketing. So by and large, what little evidence I had to doubt my own understanding of the world was not enough to overcome that. I am a nerd. I was very lonely romantically for a large portion of my life. And I consider myself someone who is relatively intellectually stimulated. I always read a lot. I like doing puzzles. I like making stuff, designing games, that sort of thing. Was never the sporting type, I've never been particularly capable in that direction. So it's definitely fell into this, this bucket of being this lonely nerd who was this relatively, fancied himself a logical thinker, liked doing logic puzzles and that sort of thing. Was always big into games. I wasn't allowed to engage with them very much as a child or a teenager, but once I got to university, I sort of had fun exploring that hobby, and got more into the culture of it. And so far at this point, I get to about age 20, 21, and I've had no real push to... I've not seen anything, really, that was strong enough or significant enough, or that I was able to connect the dots and realize that my thinking that sexism was a thing of the past was incorrect. That never, nothing crossed that barrier. When I was 21, I entered into a relationship with a fellow student, who I would say would probably describe herself as strongly feminist. But being students, at this point, she was a couple of years younger than me, but we're both very much the headstrong, like, yeah, I'm going to solve problems, figure it out, you stay up till 2 a.m. Discussing philosophy type of people, right? A lot of people do that in university. And sort of, it's fun to think that you've got the world figured out. And as such, I was not particularly ready or willing to have that idea overturned. And I think the way that Emma presented her feminism pushed me away a bit, in that she talked in some very strong absolute terms, or what I heard as such. There's a lot of very scary terminology in feminism if you're someone who would in theory be sympathetic and believes in equality, but hasn't kind of gone, like, hopped over the wall of realizing that it is actually a thing that you need to care about now in, the 2000s, 2010s as it was. Yeah. No. This would have been like 09, 10, I think. So she would talk about, like, the patriarchy, and that just sounded like a conspiracy theory to me. The idea that, there was this club of men who ran the world. This is just how it came across. And obviously I was like this person who spent a lot of his teenage years like going, oh, why don't girls like me? Feeling very small, very almost afraid of women, very sort of disempowered in that regard, and had never done anything malicious. At least, like, even now, to my knowledge, I don't think I ever did anything that was like particularly bad to anybody. I say that honestly, like, I genuinely, I've I certainly probably said some stuff that I now consider embarrassing in conversations with my ex, but, I wasn't really having it, and it all seemed to me like, well, maybe this is in some parts of the world, but not here, or that seems like a niche example. You're all trying to justify how this fits into my existing worldview, right? And there was a clash there, and we definitely like argued about this a couple times. Shortly after that, I found some friends who I now recognize, looking back, were just oozing with red flags. There was one guy in particular who was, in retrospect, really toxic. He wasn't too bad initially, but then, like, at some point he had a breakup, and I think that hurt him much deeper than he let on, and it sort of pushed him down a bad route mentally. I remember at some point him just, like, we were just, a few of us were just hanging out, and he just dropped a racial slur, and there was a shocked silence in the room, but no one said anything. Like, holy crap, I should have said something. I should have just left. In retrospect, like, wow, that's bad. But that's the sort of, that's the sort of person he was becoming. But I didn't really, I knew that was bad. Of course I knew that was bad. But, like, I didn't really think about it, in the same way. And I didn't realize that, like, I didn't realize the mindset that implied. The thing that kind of got me to almost to safety, as it were, right? So if you think I'm in this position, this is by about 2013, right? I'm still never really allowed myself to have this impression challenge that, like, apart from some edge cases or some specific strict things, that my ex talked about, that, like, were probably, exaggerated, or if you looked at the stats, they didn't quite work and stuff. Sexism was generally a thing of the past, right? And I went easily 23 years of my life believing that. And it seemed logical. I hadn't seen it. I'd seen no evidence of this with my own eyes. Just stuff that people said on the internet, stuff that my ex read on, like, Jezebel or something. These sites that I thought of as, like, very sensationalist. So at that point, my views had not really been challenged in that sense. Despite my ex's efforts to do so. The way that she went about it didn't work for me, and I wasn't willing to listen. The thing that made it fall into place was something really small sounding. I was with a completely different group of friends. No one mentioned in this anecdote these anecdotes so far. And one of us, this woman said, yeah, I get catcalled all the time. There was something in her tone that was like, it was so, this like, she just said it like it was a fact of life. It was so minor. It was clearly like something that she took notice of and cared about, and that happened very frequently, but was just like a part of normal life for her. And I think maybe this was the first time that I'd properly seen an example of just normal everyday sexism. Like, a lot of what my ex talked about was really big, horrible stuff that like would have been too difficult for me to accept, almost like emotionally, like accept that this was a thing, this terrible thing. But what this lady said was like just this everyday, yeah, this is a thing. And I hadn't seen it, right? I don't recall ever noticing anyone getting catcalled. Maybe like once, like I like genuinely have never, I don't have a mental image of what that sounds like. But clearly it happened all the time. And at that point it clicked into place, like, I can miss this stuff. And it can happen even in someone's normal life. Even just every day, just off the cuff, it can happen. And at that point, that made everything click into place of like, no, this is real, this is a problem, and this is a thing that's happening. That single moment probably changed my life. Well, not probably. It changed my life. There's no guarantee that I wouldn't have had the same realization later on anyway, but like, through some other stimulus. But that moment sticks out so clearly in my mind as like the day I realized that, to use an old phrase, this is why we need feminism. The timing on this was probably quite lucky because I think it was the same year as Gamergate, which some of you may be familiar with. August of 2014, there was major uproar and harassment against a small number of developers and journalists in gaming by angry internet men, essentially, like people who, I don't know if the term incel existed at the time, but there'd be some overlap, at least now, right? Gamergate went on for a long time. I remember hearing about it initially and thinking, man, no, that sounds like nonsense. It's not right to harass somebody even if they did do a bad thing. I had no opinion on whether the person had done a bad thing, but figured they probably hadn't, from what I'd seen. That was kind of the extent of my involvement. I looked at it and went, no, that's horrible. Like, why would you do that? But a lot of folks got swept up in that. It was a big movement, and like, movement makes it sound nice. If there was a tide of bile and harassment that flooded the internet, all sorts of people got death threats, endless like doxing, harassment. It was really cruel to like, and centered around a small number of women and non-binary people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, like on the internet. And the repercussions are still being felt and will be for some time. I dodged that. Maybe if I hadn't heard, maybe if it hadn't clicked for me, I think probably like, it would have been like months before. Because there's only a small window in which I knew this lady. Like, if it hadn't clicked for me months before, maybe I'd have fallen for it too. That same year, later that same year, I started my relationship with Katie, my current partner and fiance. And at that point, I was kind of okay. I went in to my relationship with Katie thinking that, like, yes, sexism is real. Yes, it's important. Katie may experience this herself. She probably has her own feelings and her own stories, and I should listen to them. And I've learned a lot from her still, and from talking to her about it. I want to credit her for helping educate me and helping us both learn together, both about sexism and about other issues in society. The last major milestone in this development was Twitter. I joined Twitter to learn about people. Like initially, when I started, my Twitter feed has a very strong bias towards like, particularly it was like women and trans people when I started. And now I've been using it more to learn about race as well in the wake of the BLM stuff recently, and a little bit before that, but mostly recently. So, thanks to the protests in the US and beyond, lots of discussion about civil rights and prejudice against black people, and to a lesser extent other people of color. I've learned a ton. I've followed some new people, read a lot of posts. It's been harrowing and tiring, like learning about all this while, in the context of police brutality as well as the ongoing prejudices and violences that black people in this case face. But, it's necessary work and I'm glad to do it. So now I'm at the point where I'm making YouTube videos about this stuff in the hope of passing on what I've learned as a previously uninformed white guy to other people who either would like to see their knowledge affirmed, would like to hear about it from me, or are themselves, still learning and still catching up to where I happen to be. I want to clarify that I'm still learning very much. I have a long way to go. We all do. Society does. That's kind of the point. So there's a few things that could have made me... The reason I want to title this I Could Have Been an Incel is like, I feel increasingly as though I dodged a bullet. I could have been... I think there's a lot of people out there who are like nice people, maybe a little inexperienced in terms of the, broader lives of others, and think they have a reasonably good grasp on the world, but are otherwise well-meaning and would stand up for, equality, who are like two misunderstandings and a breakup away from like calling a game developer a horrible name on Twitter. Like, I do genuinely feel like there's not too far to fall when you're in that position, because the way misinformation and prejudice spreads, online in particular, is very, I want to say targeted at like that demographic of people who are unhappy with certain things and confident in their views, I guess. And in particular, there's a heavy emphasis on logical thinking, which I definitely remember I was a fan of, and I had friends who were fans of, and definitely the people I mentioned earlier who were like red flags out the wazoo, they were big logic types. They loved logic. And I think there's a lot of appeals to logic in YouTube videos and other discourse about this stuff, pushing people to say, well, yeah, logically, I've never seen sexism, therefore it doesn't exist. Therefore, why are we putting more women in video games? It's fine. And this is like a very common refrain, I think, and there's a bajillion. YouTube changed their algorithm not very long ago, to show people more videos from like outside their circle of subscribers, and I had to spend like probably 2 weeks telling it I wasn't interested in people like complaining about women in video games before it got the message. That stuff is very pervasive and really like insidious. It's easy to pick up on. You watch the wrong review video and suddenly the person has convinced you that like this game would be great if it wasn't for all those women pushing their social justice agenda on the developers to make XY change, weaken things. Like, this stuff is very omnipresent, and when I was younger, essentially, but by younger I mean like 6 years ago, I don't think this stuff was as prevalent, and certainly if it was, I wasn't watching it. I didn't really use YouTube then in the same way I do now. I only started subscribing to people on YouTube when I started streaming. Maybe a little later. So, like, nowadays I use YouTube all the time, and it's a good way of keeping up with video series and content producers that I enjoy. But at the time, I didn't really. Just use it to look up Monty Python clips. And that meant that I was insulated from any of this content that did exist at the time. But nowadays, someone in the same position would probably, A, be more likely to use YouTube more, and B, there's this huge breadth of content that YouTube's algorithms know are very popular. They will shove it in your face. It's real hard to miss out on it, and if you don't do what I did and explicitly say, no, I don't want this, it's easy to end up hearing these arguments and this rhetoric that can poison you against other people who are just making games, doing their jobs. And I think there is a common thing about like preying on logic as like a route into convincing somebody that like, no, you are right. Look, it's obvious. Society is obvious. These people are wrong. This viewpoint is nonsensical. And I guess the missing piece, the thing that I never realized at the time, is like logic is only as good as your premises, right? Logic doesn't generate information from thin air. You have to start from premises to reach a conclusion with logic. If your premises are flawed, then your conclusion is also, your conclusion is useless. It's null and void. And so if you're starting from a premise of misinformation, whether you know it or not, right? If you're starting from a premise of, well, I haven't seen sexism, therefore it doesn't exist. That's not logic. That's just incomplete information. And so any conclusion you draw from it is going to be biased by the fact that you have incomplete information. It's like, here's a silly analogy, right? Boxes exist. Let's say you've never seen a box with an apple in it. You've seen loads of boxes, but you've never seen ones with apples in. If someone comes to you and says, oh, hey, that box over there, that has an apple in it, you're going to be like, nah, no, it doesn't. I've never seen a box with an apple in it. That's ridiculous. The thing is that then your mind plays tricks on you. If the person opens the box and there's an apple in it, they go, look, an apple. And you go, yeah, but it's an outlier. Like, generally boxes don't have apples in. It's obvious. Because that's how your brain works. It's not your fault that this is how you think. This is how humans think. As I understand it. Not a neurologist, but this is what I've picked up as far as I know. This is how the human brain works. You have this sort of cognitive momentum that keeps you onto your existing ideas. And so you're like, no, it's just another... it's an outlier. Apples don't go in boxes. That's nonsense. And so at some point another person says, oh, look, there's an apple in this box, and shows you an apple in the box. And at this point you're like, well, clearly you're putting them in the boxes to spite me. Like, you're tricking me. This is nonsense. And like, the amount of apples in boxes that you have to be shown to change your mind is ridiculous. But if you are willing to listen to somebody, or if you're willing to take proper, sourced and researched data and allow that to change your understanding. If you looked up and you found a scientific paper that said, well, actually, about 50% of boxes have apples in them. They're just distributed oddly, so it's easy to miss them. Like, it's then on you to go, oh, okay, and update your thinking. If you talk to somebody and they say, yeah, every box I've ever seen has an apple in it, your natural response is to be like, nah, but, it's worth listening to people and taking their side of the story on board, especially when, the example of apples in boxes falls down here because it's not personal, it's silly, right? It's just a toy example. But in the case of instances of sexism, people are hurt, people are held back in life, by prejudice, not just sexism, by racism, by homophobia, by ableism. People are restrained from opportunities that they could otherwise have. And so what seems logical to say, well, yeah, there's not many women making video games because they're just not interested, I guess, right? And if you talk to women about it, they say, no, I want to do that. And a lot of women who make games or play games will have stories of being treated badly because of their gender or their gender presentation, being assumed to be on a lower skill, people asking, oh, well, I guess you're going to get pregnant and leave us. People assuming their work is of less value, or their time is of less value, people not taking them seriously. And a lot of that doesn't necessarily come from people acting maliciously. That's the other thing. Like, because one of the sticking points for me with this stuff was, well, I mean, I don't, if you present that information, it makes men sound like a bunch of cartoon villains, right? I don't caper around going, I'm going to put women in their place this morning. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who do, and you can see them in Twitter threads of of women everywhere. But generally speaking, that certainly wasn't my experience or my mindset. But a lot of this stuff is accidental. It's spread insidiously. Some people do it on purpose. Some people abuse their power or their stature to hurt other people or to gain unfairly from other people. But a lot of the time it is just assumptions. There are stereotypes, Think about things like, oh, well, men are more analytical. Do you have proof of that? Like, it's generally not, like, whether or not it's sort of true in aggregate, it's no reason to doubt somebody in the moment, right? If you're working with someone, a particular person, and they're like, oh yeah, I've done the calculations and I've written this new rendering routine. Your brain might go, well, and you doubt their work, whereas maybe you wouldn't if it was a guy. And that's not necessarily, like, that doesn't mean that you are a person who supports sexism consciously, but it is a sexist behavior that has been learned by society at large. And this stuff happens all the time. And I had absolutely no idea and would have no way of, like, reaching this conclusion on my own, because you cannot logic your way into that without listening to people tell their own stories and taking them seriously. And it was that one thing that, like, that one person said that was just off the cuff, this completely, like, it was relevant to the conversation, but it was, it wasn't like this big argument, it wasn't an article online, it wasn't inflammatory, it wasn't defensive, it was literally just like her life experience. And I suddenly realized that, yeah, people's lives are way different from what I might think. And that sounds like such a stupid, obvious conclusion, but it really isn't. Like, it's so hard to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to truly empathize with someone who lives on the other side of the world, or, experiences the world through different eyes from you. You can't logic out the struggles of someone who lives in a wheelchair until they tell you, right? You can't logic out the struggles of someone who faces sexism at work until they tell you about it and you listen. And that was like a really big learning moment for me that, lots of people have taught me over the years, often inadvertently. It's literally just me reading people's tweets and going, oh yeah, like that I should believe this, like this makes sense. Or people explicitly saying that, like, some of the problem is just not listening, right? And again, not maliciously, but like, you have to be, there's listening where you hear the words that somebody says and take note of them. And there's listening where you, like, approach someone's experiences or someone's message with an open mind and an open heart, and are willing to trust them without evidence to the contrary, right? Rather than looking for evidence to the contrary. That stuff is super important. Going back to other things that could have ensnared me, right? I am a gamer, in that I play a lot of games and I love games, I make games, I talk about games, it's my main hobby. And I approach it in various different facets in my life. And I suppose I am a part of gamer culture or gaming culture. I upvote memes about Dark Souls on Reddit and, joke about Dota with my Dota friends. And it's a part of my life. and a lot of most of my friends are from that sphere, from Magic players, Overwatch players, Dota players, and that same community, the wider gaming community, has a huge problem with this stuff. Because I think a lot of us do fit that mold of like relatively lonely or inexperienced, like socially awkward people. A lot of us are, socially awkward or shy. A lot of us were bullied in school, right? And a lot of us feel like we're low on the totem pole of life already, just from that, like girls don't like me, everyone thinks I'm a nerd at school, or, even I'm 30 and I still carry some of those scars, like I got bullied a lot, and that feeling of loneliness and emptiness, of like being romantically uninvolved for all bar 1 month of my first 21 years of life, that leaves marks, that stings, that's hard to deal with, and society is telling you the whole time, oh, you need to get the girl. That itself is sexist. It's like, it's bad if you don't have a partner. There's the ticking clock of settling down and stuff when you get older. Like a lot of people around my age now, I'm 30, struggle with that. Like, there's so many things that can lead us to feel ostracized. And then when someone comes along and says, no, you're actually really privileged for being a white man, you're like, well, I've never experienced privilege. My life sucks. And in any social situation, I'm always the least important person. Why am I privileged? And like, you are, right? If you live in a first world country, if you have a house, not even own a house, if you live under a roof, you're privileged, right? The bar is real low. If you don't experience people, like relevantly to this discussion, if you don't experience people who put you down for your gender, for your race, for your personal presentation, for your ability, as in lack of disability, for your sexuality, then you have a certain foot up in life compared to people who don't. And that's what privilege means. It's kind of again, it comes across like a loaded term. It's like, oh, you're privileged. There's no single level of privilege. You're not on the podium or off the podium. Everybody has things that don't get in their way and things that do, right? You can be poor and depressed and lonely and unhappy in life and feel like you have a terrible time. And that describes a lot of people, and I have every sympathy for those people. It is still possible for those things may hold you back or feel like, those things are struggles for you, and they may affect your advancement in other areas of life. But at the same time, you are not also being held back for being, maybe you're not being held back for being a woman, for instance, if you're a guy in that situation. And a lot of the time, if you take those exact same set of challenges and you apply them to someone who is female, transgender, non-binary, non-white, all sorts of, like, they'll have it even harder. And so that's not to, it's like all pain is valid. It's not to take away the fact that you have your own struggles, but there are things that cause people to struggle that are purely just prejudice, right? And we as a society need to put a stop to that. But that took me a long time to learn. Again, it's not something you can logic out, and it's not something you feel internally. Like going back to the lonely gamers thing. If people did, I was going to say if someone had told me that, people did. My ex tried, and it just came across as hollow, because I was like, well, you're telling me to check my privilege. She came from like a relatively wealthy background. So, I'd sat in a car with her family while her dad moaned about like the higher tax bands. And his salary was literally like 4 or 5 times what my father made and had to support a family on. And it's like, that rings super hollow in that situation, right? But it's exactly the same. She's privileged for being wealthy and white and intelligent in English. I'm privileged for being male and white and intelligent and well, I'm not English, but I live in England. And that understanding is important to empathizing with people. And again, it comes back to that listening thing. Like, if you're listening to someone say, oh yeah, my work is so difficult because people mistreat me as a woman, and you're going, your response is, oh, I've never seen that. No, you haven't, because, if you're coming at it from a male viewpoint, you are lucky enough, regardless of what other things are unlucky in life, to not have to worry about that. That's not something you'll experience. And the ways in which, like, I made the assumption, like, it would just be really obvious if it was, I always assumed sexism was really explicit. Like, I never saw people going, oh, you can't come in here, you're a girl. And you maybe make that assumption, like, well, no one's shutting them out of meetings. No, but maybe people are interrupting them. That's a really common thing. Like, I don't have the data offhand, but I think I saw something about this the other day. I should look this up. It's my understanding that it's very common for men, even well-meaning men, to interrupt women. And I know this because I'm a well-meaning man and I do it. And I have quite a loud voice and I like talking. So I cut people off quite easily. And a lot of women are kind of socialized to just accept that rather than push back, to just let themselves be cut off or let themselves be sidelined out of the discussion. So I have to take care that when I'm talking to someone who might behave like that, whether it's because they're a woman or something else, they might just be shy or nervous of giving their opinions, but also this can happen because they're female or they're non-binary and they're someone who is socialized to be meek. I have to make sure to give them space to if someone gives an opinion and I cut them off, to say, no, you first, or to re-amplify what they said. If someone else cuts them off, to the group, to reconvey their idea. That stuff is actually super important, and the thing is, it benefits a work environment because people have good ideas, right? And this is the other thing about the diversity argument. Workplaces statistically benefit from increased diversity. But it sounds logical to say, well, if you're hiring someone because they're a person of color, because they're a woman, because whatever, then maybe you're passing over a more qualified candidate. The actual answer is that in society at the moment, we have an issue where men are hired disproportionately. And that's not necessarily because of sexism, but it's because of stuff like, a lot of the time it's because of networking. People hire their friends. Or men are encouraged to be brave, whereas women are encouraged to be humble. And so men push for promotions or make themselves louder, take credit for things in a work environment. Again, all unconsciously. And it's so different from the mental image of like applicants being rejected because their CV has a female name on it. Even though that does happen, there have been studies that show that they've done them with race and I believe also gender, where they've a company received CVs with like identical CVs with white sounding names and black sounding names on them, and the employers rated the black sounding CVs lower. So the fact that if you've got a company that's got a diversity initiative in their hiring process, what they're doing is not like pushing out white people or men or whatever. It's offsetting that. It's offsetting whatever internal biases or societal momentum, networks of friends and colleagues that happen to be white because people associate with their own, and immigrants maybe coming to the country or people from abroad don't know anybody. Communities often segregate by income, which tends to mean segregating by race, because a lot of, it keeps itself going, right? If you've got a group of people who find it harder to get jobs, then they probably have less money. And so that stratifies society further. And so you can have this, there are absolutely malicious people and malicious agents in the system, including, for instance, our YouTube reactionaries making angry videos about the SJWs ruining Last of Us 2 or whatever. But even without any malice, even if you have a workplace without anyone acting maliciously or deliberately to keep out minorities or women from their company. It still happens. And you could never logic that out. You can only hear it from listening to people. So I had no idea of any of this. And this is stuff that I've pieced together and stuff that I'll probably try and go into greater detail on in later videos. Independently and provide, I need to actually research this stuff and provide the proper data so people can see what I'm talking about. But broadly, these things matter and these things make a difference, even if people are not trying to. Even if people are trying not to, it still happens. So this video has been long. Certainly it has been Adam short. I will hopefully try and keep others to more bite-sized single topics, but I kind of wanted to... This one is more of a personal story and how my mindset has changed and how I hope more people's mindsets will change or are changing. I mean, to be fair, how I know more people's mindsets are changing. Slowly, society is progressing. But it doesn't progress unless we push. And it is, in my opinion, it is our duty and a sort of moral necessity to listen and to care for people and to not allow ourselves to be swayed by people who appeal to our existing unconscious lack of information and our desire to be logical and to feel like we understand the world and to be part of a community of people who are like us that make us feel comfortable. It's important to not let those people make us hateful in order to pad their YouTube views. Because ultimately that's the grift, right? They want your money and they want your attention. And they want to push their own agenda, as do a lot of people. But that could have been me, right? I could have fallen for that. I could have not realized any of this. And if so, I would be a much less happy, much less caring person than I am now. I might not have been able to make my relationship with Katie work as well as it has. A lot of people take these biases into their relationships. It's really common for women to end up doing disproportionate amounts of housework. And I know because this happened to us and we talked about it without any laziness or malice on my part. I say any laziness. Obviously, I didn't want to do dishes. But at first I was like, well... at first I just didn't notice. And then I was like, well, I guess Katie wants things to be cleaner than I'm used to. And previously I'd only lived with roommates who were less clean than me. And I'd had to, push for this stuff. And eventually it was like, no, okay, I am just genuinely just not really realizing how much she's doing, not thinking about it. And that is something that I might not be socialized against in the same way that Katie is. Women are often socialized to take care of this stuff, to look after people, to take on that work, even if they full well believe that things should be equal, even if their partner believes that things should be equal, because I do, and this happened to us. And maybe if it wasn't for the understandings I'd accrued, we might not have been able to solve this problem because I might not have been willing to accept what was happening. And that could have been a real wedge in our relationship. And I think it is for a lot of people. You see, I see Ask Reddit threads sometimes about it where there's just so many, wives of husbands who are just deeply unhappy with the fact that their male partner doesn't do much to help. And is kind of oblivious or uncaring as to how much is being done and why they should take part. And that could have been me, Even if I didn't go as far as being a shouty internet man, replying to posts by female game developers or streamers to tell them that they suck. I still could have been, a guy who didn't care that his partner was doing 90% of the kitchen cleaning. It's small stuff like that. And I'm sure I still have a long way to go. I don't know what I don't know, right? I don't know what's next around the corner, what new crisis will occur, and bring something to my attention that I should have been caring about the whole time. It's hard to say, but I plan to be there for it as much as I can. Thank you for listening to my extremely long intro and subsequent ramble. I hope that this video helped you in some way. I hope that it made you feel more confident in your learnings, if you're learning. I hope that it helped you understand how much there is to learn if you are not learning. And if you are someone who knows more than me about this stuff, I hope it made you feel that there was one more person in the world that cared. And B, if I said anything wrong, please correct me, because I do not claim to be an authority in any way on any of this stuff. Just a white guy who had some useful conversations and reads Twitter a lot. And I think that's eventually circle back to where I started this video. So, yeah, thank you for listening. Have a lovely day and be kind to each other, okay?